That this is our first weekly webinar series kickoff, and the theme of the whole webinar series is Find Your Growth Leaks and Drivers. Every week, we're going to touch upon some of the biggest, hidden blockers. You can call them as leaks and drivers. So we're going to bring in various experts from the industry, and today with us we have Andrew Kaplan, and trust me, this conversation you don't want to miss at all. So Andrew, I've known Andrew for quite some time now, almost about 6 to 8 months now. I've been following his work on delivering value. He's written so much work on product-led growth, mastering activation, onboarding, retention, and you name it. But before delivering value, he was leading growth at PostScript, HTR, and he's been working with a lot of product leaders across the industry. So Andrew, super excited to have you on board. Welcome to the webinar series.
My first live. Let's do it.
Okay. So Andrew, we asked some of the audience on what are the biggest problems that they see, and we'll touch upon some of that. But maybe at the very top, could you maybe express your thoughts on what is activation? I know in the modern SaaS world, regardless of product-led growth, AI-led growth, or sales-led growth, regardless of how you acquire your customers, activation, we've heard, is something that every signed-up user has to go through, at least at the account level. Maybe could you describe a little bit about what is activation, and maybe we'll start from there.
Yeah, sounds great. So in general, I think a lot of folks maybe confuse onboarding and activation. So onboarding is really like the new user experience, what happens, the emails that you get, the stuff that you see inside of the product, maybe some of the bumpers and guardrails that are on there. But really onboarding is sort of the mechanism in the experience. And really the goal of a lot of onboarding from a company's perspective is to get a new user to experience the value. There's all kinds of good stuff that happens. You want people to use your product, but you don't just want them to use any old pieces of your tool. You want them to use the stuff that's going to give them the most bang for their buck. And all data shows that if you're able to do that, you're able to understand at a core level what is valuable for users when they sign up, and then you deliver on that premise and you make sure they experience the value inside of the tool. Usually everything that you want from a company perspective in terms of retention and likeliness to upgrade to a paid plan, usually all that stuff takes care of itself. So activation is sort of an industry term to understand, did a new account get to that moment? Did they experience the value in whatever ways we've defined it? The actual, the specific definition is always going to be slightly different depending on the organization and the tool and the ICP, but typically it is a binary moment. Either you make it to this moment or you don't make it to this moment that you can track to understand, did we deliver on the value as promised? Sometimes it's referred to as like the aha moment, but from a user's perspective, usually it's like that first time when they really understand like the value and sort of why they might continue using the product. And it's usually something that you can track that correlates to a much higher likelihood that they convert to a paid plan and continue becoming an active user over time.
Got it. So let me get this straight. So what you're saying me is that activation is getting to that first value, whereas onboarding is the things that you do to set up, your account, set up the product, and that might be the first step in getting to that value. But activation as an industry term is, whatever you do, whatever it takes for you to, get to that first value. Would that be right to say?
Yeah, I mean, activation you could think of as the output. So if we do a great job with our user onboarding and our new user experience, the output or outcome of that should be that the new accounts activate. So we want to track that to understand, did we do a good job with our onboarding? And is this new account likely to become an active user and maybe eventually a paying customer?
So maybe we'll try to go a little more deeper into this part. I know activation, has been a very new term in the industry, maybe until at least 2.5, 3 years back. Most people used to use onboarding. Maybe we'll rewind that a little bit. 2020, 2021 is where we started really talking about product-led growth. But even before that, companies who would sign up to a product, regardless of their acquisition channels, they would go through this experience of onboarding to the product. It was not very likely self-serve. Self-serve is becoming a lot more movement now. But before that, the customer success teams and various other helper teams will get on a call with the customers, demo the product. So how has this activation changed Maybe if you could describe that in terms of the historical aspects of what used to happen before the PLG products came in, uh, versus what's happening now, right, with PLG and AI-led growth coming in.
Yeah, it's actually how I started my career before I ever learned about the term product-led growth, or I got into working and leading growth teams. I worked at HubSpot. And
Hmm.
what I would do at HubSpot, this is kind of before they even really had a trial, is I would work with new HubSpot customers that had just purchased, and I'd help them do stuff inside of the tool. And eventually what we realized is if you have a call with somebody and they show up to the call and you spend an hour or however long talking to them, you can usually get them to do some stuff. If you suggest, here's the benefits of doing that, here's the common mistakes people make when doing this, here's how it relates to your goals, right? But it was all manual, all hand-to-hand combat, a lot of conversations, a lot of follow-up emails, a lot of, hey, we talked about this last time, why didn't you do it? But for a long time, that worked fine. And then eventually companies realized, I think really because of what we saw on the B2C side, with all the different mobile apps and consumer products and things like that, it seemed like they were having a lot of success doing this with no humans. It wasn't like they were against having humans in the process. It was more like it was just economical. It just made better sense for them at a lower price point, a lower monthly subscription cost. It didn't really make sense to have an expensive person jump on the call. So they just designed the products in a way that were more intuitive and got really into the gamification of how do we get people to complete certain milestones and how do we motivate them, and what are the common points where they get stuck or lost or whatever. And so basically what we realized on the B2B side is that we should do that too. And more or less, that's how I think about product-led growth. We're using the product as the primary tool for education, for adoption, for engagement, and ultimately for conversion. And basically what we're doing is just copying what happened in a manual one-to-one way from the predecessor era of SaaS.
This is very interesting. So you helped HubSpot customers onboard. And you're part of the customer success, the growth teams, and you and your teams would get onto customer calls. So how did maybe we'll touch upon that. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
And HubSpot had so many products, right? So you had you had the marketing product, the CRM, product, whole bunch of other, analytics tools that you had. How would you decide, as a customer success manager or growth leader at that time, that this is what it means to have the aha moment? Unless you ask the customer what would they want to achieve, how would you know that this is the aha moment? Maybe if you
It's
can throw some light on what do you mean by an aha moment, and your
Yeah, it's
experience in
actually the
HubSpot.
second. It's actually the second. So a lot of what we would do would be to start by understanding the reason for signing up in the first place. What were their goals? How did HubSpot, or insert whatever product we're thinking about, how did that product assist, or how is it involved in the process of them achieving whatever business goals or marketing goals or whatever it is that they have? And then what we would do is show them different pathways and different things that they could do inside of the tool to help them
Interesting.
experience value on their terms. Now, eventually, if you do that thousands and thousands of times, what you start to see are the same outcome patterns. So when you talk to folks who had been really happy, that had stayed customers for a long time, and you say, hey, what was that moment when you first felt like you experienced value? A lot of them would say similar answers. When we generated our first lead, when we got our first sale from one of those leads that came in, that was the moment where we really got it. And everyone's journey to that point was different, but typically they would all say some flavor of, we're growing our business faster, we're growing our database faster, we're converting more customers ultimately from this. And so that became more or less, I'm oversimplifying, but that became more or less the activation moment. And then the journey to get there was very customizable and personalized based on what we learned about customers. And essentially my whole onboarding philosophy and the framework that I've kind of stumbled into on the B2B side essentially mimics that. It's understanding what are the common patterns, what does value look like from an output perspective, and then what are the different pathways that users might take to get there. And how can we design those pathways and put the right prompts and have the right delivery mechanisms, have the right email come into play, and what are the segments that we should use to help them get there? And how do we make sure that they end up, experience value and converting? So that's more or less kind of how I thought about it and how we went about it back in those days.
Got it. So could you give some examples on, what were these aha moments for HubSpot? And I know you worked with, Wistia and Postscript and whole bunch of other companies that you advise. Maybe, to our audience, this is a recorded call. So if you could maybe share some insights on getting to figuring out what that aha moment for the customers is, and especially for early SaaS founders, someone who's not yet reached revenue. They don't yet have a constant motion, or a consistent motion of, visitor to lead, to sale.
Mhm.
How would you help them think that what is an aha moment? And especially maybe if you could have some case studies on HubSpot, Postgres, Wistia, or any other customer that you've worked with.
Yeah, happy to share some examples. Let's put HubSpot to the side because that's sort of a separate beast and a very large
Mhm.
horizontal company at this point. So a little
Yeah.
bit more complexity there. But maybe I'll share the process to finding the answer, and then we
Hmm.
can maybe talk about a few examples. So actually, I'll share PostScript. I think it's actually a great example, and I'm not going to share anything proprietary. So I just want to kind of
Hmm.
caveat this. But when I worked at PostScript, I joined in the very early stages. So I think I was employee number 11. They had a few hundred customers at that point, but like relatively new, a few million in ARR at that point. And so obviously they had the inklings of something, but they were not at product
Hmm.
market fit. We didn't have maturity. It was very, very, loose and wild in those days. And so we were trying to formalize and figure a lot of stuff out. Now, at some point, we wanted to spend more time on onboarding and activation, but we didn't know what success would look like because the product was still relatively new. So what we did is we talked
Hmm.
to a few, like I literally had, we had an offsite as a company, and we invited a few customers that were like one of the first 10 customers to the offsite, and pulled
Interesting.
them aside at some point and said, hey, you've been with the product for a while. Would you mind sharing what was it? If we could go back in time, what was it that you saw or experienced that got you excited to keep using the tool? And they all more or less said the same thing. They were like, there was all these different, for context, PostScript is a text marketing app. It's one of the larger Shopify apps in the Shopify ecosystem. But
Hmm.
at that time, it was really early. And so we said, what was it? And there's all these different text campaigns that you could send. You could send one-off campaigns like email. You could send automated campaigns like abandoned cart nurture. You could do all this different stuff.
Hmm.
But they all said the same thing. They were like, we didn't actually care about sending the campaigns. What got us really excited is when we saw our first revenue or our first orders and our first dollars come in as a result of the programs. Now, if you had asked, and I did ask, 10 people, the other 10 people who worked at PostScript, like, hey, what's our activation moment? They'd all say, when you send the campaign, right? Sending the campaign, that's the aha moment. When you ask customers, they're like, we don't care about sending the campaign. We pay for the campaigns to be sent. What we really care is the result of the campaign. And so that's the thing
Interesting.
that we tracked there. And there's usually a parallel at every business. Like if you take another really easy example, take a product that everybody knows, like a Canva, right? And I have no inside baseball here. I don't advise or coach anybody at Canva, but from the outside looking at it, it feels very obvious to me. It's not creating your first design. It's when you share that design or use that design in some
Hmm.
intended way, right? There's different goals that people have for using a tool like that. Maybe you're a teacher, it's for education. Maybe you're a marketer, it's for whatever. So your path in the templates that you use might be different, but activation is probably largely the same. It's when you did the thing and then you used it for some business goal. And that's usually the definition that you're looking for when you're early stage. Asking qualitative and interviewing some folks or sending them a quick email is a good place to start. And then you can look at quantitative, as you get a little bit more data and get a little bit more confidence in the numbers, and there's a little bit more weight behind the statistical significance there. So
Hmm.
that's kind of like the journey that I would think about.
So would you say that the outcome of an activity that they will perform using a tool like PostScript or Wistia or HubSpot
Yep.
is typically where you should think about, hey, this could be the first aha moment. And what you mentioned about PostScript is the revenue that came in because of the campaign and not the campaign itself. So
Correct.
setting up of the campaign, would you say is the onboarding, uh, you know, um, and maybe having a first workflow of creating the campaign and sending it, adding contacts, whatever that might be, and that's just still the activities that you would perform to get to the aha moment, which in this case was almost a quarter later, right? Would that be right?
Correct. There's typically different milestones. Usually there's a setup process where if
Hmm.
you think about a PostScript or a Canva or a Wistia, a lot of it is, tell us the business name, tell us what you want to name your account, give us your brand colors, your logo if that's
Sure.
important, upload your contacts if you're an email or a list management tool or a CRM. But typically, there's a set of milestones that everybody needs to accomplish to get to the outcome, which would be activation. So to use the PostScript example, yes, it would be, set up your plan, give us your contacts or the phone numbers that you've got, or collect the phone numbers on your website so you can build your database, then create some type of campaign. Could be an automated campaign. It might be a one-off campaign, not specific to you and your goals, but that's a milestone that obviously you would need to do to get to the outcome of sending a message that eventually generates revenue. Correct.
So this is very interesting, and this is also very contrary. Maybe let me ask this slightly, leading questions. With PostScript, you mentioned that you brought in some customers for your offsite conversations, and you asked them what was the value. Let me ask a couple of questions for me to maybe understand this a little more. These customers were paying customers, or these customers were still in the process of understanding the value, and the reason that you brought him is essentially to convert them into a paid customer. What was the theme for why did you get these customers?
It was the first. So
The
these
first
were paying customers that had been with us for some period of time and had achieved some level of success that inspired them to continue paying. Right. So these were existing paying customers. It was a month-to-month plan, I think, at that point. And so they had experienced something that obviously, allowed them to experience value and then continued to re-up their plan.
Got it.
We wanted to understand if we could go back in time, what was that first moment where you felt like, maybe this is a tool where we should invest a little bit more time? And so I think that that's a good type of user to look for. The ideal outcome or the ideal interview would be a customer who's relatively new, who can still remember what that moment is and articulate it and hasn't been using for so long that it's like, they just don't even remember what it was like to go through that new user experience and to be lost at first and then figure stuff out and sort of have that feeling of like, ooh, all right, maybe this is something for us. And so ideally you want to ask folks that are closer to that.
Okay. And in the case of PostScript, or any other, were there a single user who would experience the value? Or were you tracking, or were you trying to consider the entire account, the entire company, being able to experience that value? How did you guys think about it at that time?
Account level.
Account level. Okay, not user level.
Yeah, I mean, that was a tool where a lot of times, it depends on the company size, but selling to SMBs. So a lot of those where the primary user, would be one. But of course, there are larger teams where there's multiple users. And what we really cared about was at the account level. And if you continue that on, the goal of onboarding is to eventually retain and turn, a new user into an active user. And that's sort of the first checkpoint in that process. And that's what we care about on the account level. Because especially if you're selling to marketers, they switch jobs every couple of years. And so you need to activate on the account level. The idea outcome would be that you have multiple users on an account. So if one of them leaves or switches jobs or there's a layoff or a restructuring, you've got other folks that can continue on making sure that tool is leveraged to get value.
Got it. What I find strange about this particular story, especially for PostScript, is, and maybe those were different days, right? When you got the answer of what is the first time that you experienced the value or the aha moment, and you mentioned 3 months, right? So the activation time from the time they signed up to the first value that they received, is the revenue that came in because of the campaigns that they ran on PostScript. What would you say is an ideal time, if I call that as time to first value from the time you sign up, or any user within the account signs up and they experience the value by doing various things. Are there any industry benchmarks or metrics, around this particular, because this 3 months seems to be pretty long, and with the millennial generation and my daughter, and I see so many people starting to use various ads apps now, their attention span does not last more than 10-15 minutes. So this activation time or time to first value of 3 months, was that an anomaly at that time, or is that changing as the industry progresses?
If I said 3 months, I misspoke, Guru. Yeah. So, much less than 3 months. Usually within the first few days, ideally within the first day for world-class
within the first day. Okay.
Yeah. I think what I was articulating maybe poorly was that it's helpful to chat with folks to understand what was their activation moment within the first 3 months of signing up, so they could still remember what that moment was and it still feels recent. But the actual activation moment itself, the shorter you can get that, usually the higher your retention and conversion is. So the ideal outcome, I don't know if there's any industry benchmarks here, at least not any that I know offhand, but what I can say is anecdotally through the companies that I've worked at and the companies that I've advised is typically the companies that have world-class activation and very high conversion and retention metrics, it's typically within the first 2 days, and the best ones are within a few hours.
Got it. So if I call that as maybe an initial set of benchmarks, and I'm sure there's many benchmarks out there, is the time to first value at an account level that you're suggesting to measure it should be in hours, not in terms of days or weeks? And the more complex onboarding, the more complex activities that you would have, would essentially, get your customers, get your users to drop off along the way. Maybe let's talk a little bit about it, right? So you mentioned at the very beginning of the call, as you were introducing, some of the things that you do with your customers, you mentioned about helping SaaS founders design and understand what these aha moments are. You help them also design the onboarding prompts that that needs to be, shared with the users. So how would you think has the SaaS industry evolved? Because earlier customer success would, get on a call with the customers, maybe one or two of them get on to, hey, do this, do this, do this. Like, all right, so this is your use case. Go to the left pane, click on the third menu, click on the sixth step. Now experience the value. Has that design changed now, or are you seeing a new evolution of, hey, this is a very specific use case, do only these one or two or three things, and then you see value? How do you see the design evolving around the space?
I think there's a few components to that. One is maybe a philosophical change, which is in that era, you would have folks complete 100% of the setup process before they do the first thing inside of the tool. Typically, the setup process in those environments were long and painful. And not that the setup process has been abandoned nowadays, but from what I have experienced and what I see, typically the world-class apps actually break setup into what is the minimum viable setup experience? Like what is the least amount of stuff that we need to get out of the way so that we can really start using the tool? And then what's everything else that we can do later? And typically finding that is a little bit more art than science, and it's a little bit different depending on your product. So I've seen that as like a philosophical change, which is that we don't need to do all of the things up front. I've also seen a movement towards leveraging templates more in a product-led environment, meaning in the world where, let's say you're a CRM tool or an email management tool might be a good example. So if you're an email management tool and the value is probably sending your first email that customers receive or your list receives, you're not gonna be able to send an email until you've got your list in there. But typically getting your list is a pain in the butt, and getting it imported takes time, right? Those are all things that insert friction and time and like confusion into the process. So for a company like that, maybe having a list that you could borrow from them where it sends sort of a dummy email to an AI alias or something like that, so that you could still experience what it would be like to receive and send the emails and get the email data and understand what the click data looks like and all that stuff would still allow you to experience the value, but much, much quicker than it would be if you went through the full setup process up front. So breaking setup into multiple steps, leveraging templates in certain ways, and then also really simplifying and focusing on clean, simple user experience and user design, I think are the other elements that I've seen a huge shift towards. Because in this world, it doesn't really work if the product is not intuitive and easy to use and fast and snappy and simple, and all that stuff becomes really important.
Yeah, I think, as more and more competition heats up, your advice on simple, effective design, very use case centric, use templates, all of these are tactics to essentially reduce the time to value. And have you seen this? Maybe let me ask this in maybe a three-part question. The first one is the design of the onboarding flow itself. And I think you mentioned about, hey, ask them what's, I'm just regurgitating what I've learned from you now. Ask your end users, within the app, what is it that specifically they are looking to, get done? Sometimes you might call them as use cases. Sometimes you might call them as scenarios. Uh, you know, grant them access to templates, grant them access to something that is quick and fast and dirty, so that they can experience the value, not necessarily wait for the whole long haul of things. For example, with email systems like Brevo, Mailchimp, uploading the contacts, as you mentioned, takes a longer time, but designing the campaign, with various templates should be dead easy, right? The second step that I think you mentioned is connecting the dots, between all of these steps. And I've seen, and would love to ask you on this one. I've seen that, hey, you give the first value. Let's say, for example, you take Mailmodo or Brevo or Mailchimp. You grant them the template. They open up the template. They love it. They start, putting that, and then they abandon. right? They abandon that template, and then they don't return for the next 3-4 days. So what would you say went wrong, in something like this? And I've seen this several times. I used to be part of the cybersecurity, set of products in my past career. I built various things where you say, hey, you go connect to your AWS cloud, or Azure cloud. You bring in all the resources, and we'll scan behind the scenes. And then we realize that people don't want to wait for so long, so we would start showing them results, almost in real time. And even if that was pretty slow, we would show them sample data, and we'll show them that, hey, we are working towards it. So we would retain their attention, on there's something that is happening, rather than say, hey, come back tomorrow. But in this particular case, if the users are dropping off, you've given them, the first activity a template, but the users still don't, achieve the value. How would you think about that whole value realization? If that to be a framework on set of activities that needs to be done to get to that aha moment, how would you split that? Maybe with an example of, the email system that you talked about.
All right, this is a long question. I'm gonna do my best here,
Sorry.
Guru. So I'm gonna answer it maybe slightly differently, and feel free to interrupt me and redirect me. There's a framework that I think about when you work through onboarding. There's almost two components to it. There's some foundational stuff that I think everybody should do, and then there's a moment where you need to break through a plateau. And then there's more advanced stuff. And the more advanced stuff doesn't work if you didn't nail the first stuff. So I view templates, I'll just give you the category and then we can go back to the beginning. I view templates as one of those things that when you hit a conversion plateau, that is one of the tools in the belt that can help you to break through that plateau. But if you have that tool without the right foundation in place, it's not going to be impactful. And it's something that you should do sequencing later versus going template first. So here's the framework that I think about. One, for any company that's looking to either build or improve their onboarding flow, you've got to start by getting crystal clear on what that moment is. What is the value in the user's definition that is sort of the core value of the tool? What is the activation moment? If you do that, then you can detail out kind of what we've been talking about. What is the minimum viable setup? And then what are the milestones? Like what are the things that they actually need to do inside of your tool to get to the output of that activation, of that aha? So step one is get crystal clear on what that value is. Step two is see if you can reduce that time to value as much as possible. For most companies, there's like an addition by subtraction thing where like typically they just have way too many visual elements and way too many steps in the process. And if you can strip that stuff out, usually you can get folks to experience that value quicker. So that's the second step. The third is to guide users through those milestones. This is like one of the more obvious things that everybody misses, which is you got them inside of the tool. And for 9 out of 10 tools that I sign up for, I typically get through the setup process and then I make it to the dashboard page. And then I have this kind of now what feeling where it's like, well, what am I supposed to do now? And then because I like the internet, I click around and I get lost. And then eventually I go back to the dashboard and maybe I'm able to figure it out. Maybe I'm not. And so just having a strong perspective on what are the milestones that you want folks to complete and then how can you encourage them to do that? Typically, there's different delivery mechanisms. Your pop-ups, your tour tips are part of that. But the more effective ones tend to be like checklists or getting started pages that just say, hey, step number 1, go do this thing. Here's how you go do it. Step number 2, go do this thing. So get clear on the value, reduce the time to that value as much as possible, guide users through those milestones with different prompts and delivery mechanisms. Those are the foundational pieces. And then the more advanced stuff to help you break through plateaus when you experience them are personalization. So as marketers, there's a million different examples where segmenting and personalizing helps you to convert better, right? We know that on the ad side, we know that with landing pages, we know a million examples of why and where that works. Same is true with your onboarding flow. And it mirrors what people do on the phone when you talk to them, right? Like, you and I talk on the phone. If I'm a new customer, the first thing you're going to ask is more information about me and what I'm looking to track and what our needs are and things like that. And so we want to do the same thing inside of the tool. We want to surface some information and then use that information to customize the experience that happens later. I call it onboarding recipes. It's one of the things you can do to break through the plateau. The next thing you can do is leveraging templates to help users power through that empty account challenge quicker. And then maybe the last tool in our belt that we can think about for breaking through our onboarding and activation plateaus are seeing if we can build more product momentum before they ever get inside of the tool. See if we can start surfacing either different language, different copy, different self-guided demo experiences, things like that, so that when they do sign up, they've already kind of done the first few things that they'll need to do inside of the tool, and they'll be way more motivated to power through that stuff. So that's like kind of the framework that I think about. It's a six-step framework. First three are foundational, second three are to break through the plateaus.
Yeah, got it. I think the first one or two, I'm seeing that, and I talk to a lot of SaaS founders. I've seen the foundational things like asking questions, who you are and all of that, happens in most of the products. But I think what you mentioned about, the last four, maybe we'll take some examples. If Andrew could use some examples, could you maybe share some insights on what could be a personalization? How could you use that as part of the onboarding? Because I think most SaaS products now are asking, hey, or even do an online lookup with ChatGPT or various other
Yeah.
enrichment tools that, hey, this is Andrew, and this is your LinkedIn URL. All of that information is now getting more and more into the SaaS product the moment you're signing up based on the email lookup. But what is missing is the using of that information,
Yep.
to determine the next course of the journey, right? And then after you achieve a first value, that finishes, right? So maybe you tell, if we could talk through the experience about what does personalization mean, and if there are any breakages in that particular value chain. You mentioned that a six-step process. What happens if the user gets stuck in second or the third step? How do you prompt them to go, beyond the second to the third to the fourth and nudge them towards it?
Yeah. Let's take the first part of it. So you're right. When you sign up for tools, either they ask for nothing and you sign up with Google and they have nothing about you and then they go and enrich behind the scenes, or they ask a
Mhm.
million things up front and then they don't use it. What I have found is when it comes to driving behavior inside of the app, there's I've tested this like a million different ways. I've tested like title and company size and revenue and industry and vertical and all this kind of stuff. I found very little impact in activation and conversion for the companies
Interesting.
where for the companies that I've been involved with. What I found much more leverage on are these two ways to segment. One is based on your goal for signing up, your job to be done, so to speak. Even,
Hmm.
Wistia is a great example. It's a video hosting platform. And
Hmm.
your reason for hosting a video is usually marketing related. But even within marketing, are you hosting videos to showcase your brand? Is it to drive more leads? Is it to integrate video inside of your conversion and your sales stack and your sales process? There's a few different examples. You want to leverage video inside of your
Hmm.
analytics tools. And based on that answer, we show you different stuff. And what we see is that the conversion, or what we used to see, is that the conversion rates were drastically different with certain goals. And so then all of a sudden you've got a vector where you can prioritize certain higher value segments. Some of those answers are going to correlate to different plans, which might be a higher
Hmm.
lifetime or lower lifetime value.
Hmm.
You can use that data, to go and update your acquisition targeting and your acquisition campaigns to get more of the better kinds of users. You can cookie them and do all kinds of cool stuff. And typically it leads to higher conversion when you use that information to customize the journey that they see inside of the tool. So that's one, their use case or job to be done. The second is their level of experience.
Hmm.
So if you treat beginners the same way that you treat a power user, they're both frustrated by that, right? That's not the right level of education for either. And
Got it.
typically beginners convert at very, very low percentages. More advanced users who are maybe buying the tool for the second, third time just at a new company convert way higher. And so if you can learn those two vectors, you can leverage that information to determine what stuff to show them and what level of advanced, like case studies, examples, functionality to surface during the journey as well. So I love that kind of stuff. Those are the two vectors that I've seen work well across a few different companies and different organizations. That's,
Mhm.
I think, a good place to start.
Got it. Got it. So maybe let's go through this particular journey. Let's say, some of these users, you've already segmented them, you personalized, the use cases, like the example that you gave about Wistia on, you're asking them not just on that you want to create a video, but where do you want to use it? When do you want to use it? What's the purpose of, doing this particular video, and using that and giving them prompts saying that, hey, for something like this, you do this. For the second use case, do something like that. Walk me through the process of, let's say, if the users are going through this particular process and they see that, hey, there's a checklist of 5, 10, 15 items, and they get discouraged by the number of steps that they have to do it. Do you have any recommendations on what's the bare minimal number of, number of steps that one should have as part of the checklist so that they can get the value? Is it like 3? Is it 5? I mean, I think anything which is more than 3 or 4, it's very, very difficult to comprehend. Why would they take so long to go? And what's your experience and what's your advice to various SaaS companies that you advise on?
It's a great question. Philosophically, the less number of steps, the better. What's interesting is there's probably like a flip side, which is if there's such a small number of steps, you shouldn't really need that much guidance, right? It should
Yeah,
just be like the intuitive way that you use the tool. If it's only a 3-step thing, that should just be the design, is to get
yeah,
people to do those 3 steps. What I have found, I have a hard time answering this, but I agree, right? And there's data that shows if you use, I personally have not seen a ton of like great experiences that have like these long tours, and there's all kinds of data that shows after 7 steps, it's like nearly, might as well just rip it out and have nothing,
yeah,
because people just get annoyed by it. I think probably 5 is a reasonable place to start. If you've
yeah.
got 5 steps, maybe the first one's already checked off. You can build in some of that indebted progress, or excitement and momentum that's already been built. And then there's maybe 4 additional steps that they need to complete inside of the tool. That to me is a good place to start. In my experience, that's pretty common. Shouldn't be too many. It's enough that it seems like they're important enough to do and provide enough value. And then if the carrot is large enough at the end, they should be motivated to do it. So that to me feels like a reasonable place to start.
Interesting. Yeah. So 5 seems to be, at least your recommendation on that.
Mm-hmm.
Here's maybe an anecdotal story. So I was recently talking to the founder of MotherDuck. MotherDuck is a database company. They do, very similar to Postgres and analytics combined, together. And they did not have an onboarding flow. They would assume that the developers would go and understand how to work with the database. So they would just immediately after the sign up, they would throw them into, hey, here's the left menu, go do, create a table, whatever that is. Almost about 4 to 5 months back, they introduced, 2 steps, create a table, right? Upload some data and write a query, right? So like 3 steps towards this. And beyond that, they still kept the same left long list of left pane, almost like 40, 50 items into that one. And they realized that just by showcasing the value that, create a table, upload some data, write some queries and see how fast it is performing, they were able to experience and get that user to stay on and try more and more things. Likewise, when I talk to a cybersecurity company, which is more of a fintech and cybersecurity combined, so they have a 11-step process, and they realize that if they don't guide them beyond step number 3, they were seeing a lot more drop-offs. So they would go and say, hey, here's a checklist of 11. After step number 3, you will get some value, and they will pause, and then they will progressively load in the next, set of 4. And then after they achieve the value, they progressively load in the next, 4 or 5. And there are some techniques that people follow. And but I think what you mentioned about number 5 seems to be, a good number. On the other hand, we recently onboarded to Amplitude. So we ourselves are using Amplitude, to go, it does not have any guidance. It just throws you into, hey, here's a script and then go look at my documentation, right? And then our teams had a, very troubling time and going to the documentation, figuring out, hey, if I want to do something of that sort. Sure enough, the amplitude.com/easy, where you give all these templates, those are off the product. You have to go off the product, right, to understand that and then import that into the product. Very, very difficult to connect the dots, right? But
That's
we
a lot for
tested,
people.
yeah. So that throws you off. And then while you're doing that, you'll get customer success calls from Amplitude and say, hey, you know what? We correlated your company domain, very likely the size that you are in. And these are the things. They would send that over email to us, not within the product. So there are all these things that happen outside of the product. Do you have any guidance on, should those be inside the product, or do you think that this whole thing about outside and inside of the product, are 2 different things? Should they over time merge? What's your guidance on how do you help something like this?
Connective tissue in my mind between those 2 examples is who you're selling to. Because there are certain audiences where there's maybe more tolerance for stuff like that. But I would say as a best practice, keep them inside of the tool. It's really hard to get people to use your product. It's extremely hard to get them to sign into your product if they're not in the mood for signing into your product. And the longer you can keep them inside of your tool making momentum, generally, the more likely it is they're going to experience value and keep using the tool. Now, there's some edge cases, right? So some of the examples that you shared might be an edge case, which is for some of these tools, like an Amplitude, the setup process is extremely long, right? To connect all of your data sources. We talked about, examples where, we want to try to minimize the activation experience to within a few hours or a few days at most.
Mm-hmm.
That's one where it's a few days at least, right? So it's a very technical buyer, and technical buyers tend to have very little patience for in-app prompting. And so I'm not shocked to hear that some of those like more developer focused tools don't do that, because that makes sense for their ICP. They tend to be investigators where they like go and find stuff on their own, like culture that kind of fits the ICP. And it seems like they've, mirrored that inside of the tool. The flip side to that is one of the companies that I was advising. I'm going to oversimplify. It was sort of like a Canva, but for school athletic directors. Think high school coaches and people that run high school basketball teams and things like that, all the way up through college level athletics.
Mm-hmm.
And those folks are so busy, have so much going on. It's like you got to put everything inside of the tool. It has to have whatever you need in there. If you ask them to leave and go to another tab, the likelihood that they come back and remember and don't get distracted by somebody coming into their office and interrupting them is so low. It's like we got to keep that momentum. And there was we had data that showed that. So the connective tissue to me becomes who's the ICP and how does your product fit into their life and how they've been using other tools.
Yeah, and this is interesting. So I think, thank you, Andrew. I think, your 6-step process is just amazing. And maybe if you have a link towards, towards a document which can guide you, through that, we can share that, to the live audience here as well. And by the way, to all the audience who's still listening, and then, we open up to all the questions that you might have. You can send that through LinkedIn chat, or you can join us directly on the Teams and and ask these questions directly to Andrew. Andrew, I have maybe 2 more questions before we take a break for any live audience questions and then go beyond it. So the first question is about a sales-led company who has been having a very innate process of getting the customer success teams to talk to customers, onboard them, do POCs, right? And then say, hey, yep, they are onboarded. Go to the CRM and say, hey, this particular customer is now onboarded. Assign that ticket over to the sales team and say, hey, now the POC is done. All of this is done. Please go talk to them more about converting that into a paid plan or whatever that might be, right? So there are many, 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 many sales-led companies who are in that particular bucket where customer success teams are the ones who's necessarily be in the forefront of driving the onboarding experience, the activation experience. Any advice do you have for any of these companies on how they should change the mindset of reducing the overhead of the people dependency with customer success and make that as part of the tool? Have you seen that, in the last maybe a year or 2? Have you been working or consulting with any such companies? Any thoughts on how they can change?
Yeah. So the question is, I just want to make sure I understand the nuance. Are we talking about how do we find balance between a self-serve and a sales assisted model? Or are we talking about how do we change the model that we've got so that we don't need such reliance on human intervention?
The change to the organizational DNA that customer success is the only one who should do the onboarding and not the product itself. There are a lot of SaaS founders that I talk to who've crossed maybe 10 million, 15 million, like, hey, we want to go only after larger and larger customers, but that also means that they're spending a lot more money on customer success to get them onboarded. It takes them almost 15 days to 30 days from a POC to to an actual onboarding, and because of the schedules and all of that, it really is about a month and a half or 2 delayed. So any thoughts on how they can change their organizational DNA that we can actually move the friction that is coming in because of the customer success teams and make it a lot more simpler for for the customers to do it more by themselves, but the customer success can hype and can guide them, can jump onto maybe a 15-minute call on a weekly basis rather than a 1.5 2 hour call.
Right. Or maybe even do like one-to-many product workshops or office hours kind of stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that you could operationalize that. But I think the culture side, I need to think about 2 things. One is maybe a realization that, well, I guess it has to come from the top, right? There's some ICPs where it just makes sense if the time to value is too long, or if the company that is onboarding is just too large and they're going to need some white glove support and some custom service level agreement stuff. It might make sense to just have humans always be that, right? And there's many companies that have scaled to big businesses that way. But if you have a mix of large, medium, smaller companies within your organization, I think it starts with just understanding that the largest hybrid companies, your Canvas, your Miro, your Airtables, like they all have an environment where 80% of the customers buy touchless, and their team identifies who that largest 15 to 20% are, either by their firmographics or their behavior, or maybe they just raise their hand and self-identify themselves, and they just service that top 15 to 20%. And so I think it starts with just understanding that the largest, most mature companies have that model. Then you can start to take the steps to build that in yourself. And there's some great first steps, like what we just talked about, where you can start to think about how do we have some one-to-many communication and one-to-many engagement tools like product office hours and, new sign-up onboarding calls that are one-to-many, things like that. You could also explore some product-led marketing tools. I'm thinking about things like self-guided demos and things like that just showcase the product in action before they actually sign up and work with a human. That might just, even if they do work with a human, get them through that process faster because they're already kind of warmed up and have already seen what to expect. So a few things to think about there. I think every organization should define operating principles, which are just like a set of values to guide the work. Like we're talking a mix of like, what should the stuff be? Like what should the strategy and tactics be? And then also philosophically, what's important to the way that we make decisions and execute? Is creating self-service first solutions important to us? If so, we should write it down and make it a team operating value and an operating principle so that we can embody that in all of our work and start to identify more of those solutions. I find that helps a lot more on the cultural side.
Got it. We have a question from the audience. The question I'm just going to read out. If you have about 5 to 10 odd signups that are happening every week, what are the metrics I should measure to see whether these accounts have completed the activation? Any thoughts, any guidance on that?
5 to 10, say that first part again.
5 to 10 signups a week.
Cool.
So activation, for all of these companies or constantly keep on signing up.
Yeah. So if I had 5 to 10 signups a week, I would actually try to be talking to most of them at this stage, right? We want to create one-to-many solutions. And in these early days, that qualitative feedback is more valuable than the quantitative. So I would try to be talking to all of them. I would ask them 3 questions, or I put 2 up, but I meant to say 3 questions potentially. One would be, hey, why did you sign? And again, I don't know the tool that we're talking about, but agnostic of tool, I would be asking, hey, why did you sign up in the first place? I'd maybe even insert this as an open-ended text field, either in the sign-up process or directly afterwards. Hey, what was your main goal for signing up? Open-ended. I want to get as many of those answers as possible. I want to ask for the folks that use the product and engage in a meaningful way. Hey, do you feel like you got value out of it? If so, when was that moment where you felt like you first really understood that value? And if they do end up purchasing, I would also ask them right after they buy, hey, thanks so much. Would you mind sharing what was it that inspired you to swipe your credit card and become a paying customer with us? And my goal would be to take that information and to eventually be able to identify what are the highest value use cases. So like what goals are the ones that we're most excited about, that seem to get the most value, that are maybe worth the most. I want to understand that activation moment, which we've already talked about. And then ideally what I'd be working towards is we call them those activation recipes, which are, if we know the reason why people signed up and the reason why they purchased, maybe they share a certain combination of features or whatever it is that inspired them to pull out their credit card and pay, then ideally what we can do is go create and adjust our onboarding experience so anyone who signs up with this goal experiences the same thing that those other folks are saying got them so excited to become a paying customer. So those are some things I'd be looking at. I'd be looking to really define what first version of activation is and then start to get a little bit of quantitative. And I'd be looking for, if I was benchmarking it again, I don't know the industry, but just maybe a good rule of thumb, somewhere maybe 35 to 40% of new users I'd be hoping to activate. And if I'm lower than that, I got a little bit of work to do and I can investigate why. If I'm above that, I'd maybe revisit my definition. And if so, I'd be focusing maybe a little bit more on the conversion side of things. Those would be a few of the first steps that I would take.
Got it. To the person who's asked this, survey, feedback, and then figure out if the activation rate is about 25, 30%, and go beyond that. So we have next question. What about all the customers, all the accounts who have not activated? Any tools you can suggest to recover them?
No, this is like the bane of my existence. If they don't activate, If they don't activate and they're using the tool, there are things that you can do, right? You can prompt them. If it's a mobile app, you could send them a push alert. If you have their phone number, you could send them an SMS, right? You could do all these things to remind them, to try to spur behavior. If they're not engaged and they signed up and they did what a lot of new accounts do and they poke around for like 5 minutes and then they leave and they don't come back, almost no amount of time, effort, and notifications can get them back. And I hate saying that because it feels defeatist to say it, and that's not aligned with like my personal life philosophy, which is like there's always an opportunity. But it's just what I've learned after doing this work for a long time. It is nearly impossible to re-engage folks who have already made the mental decision to disengage.
Okay.
And even if you survey them, you might think, well, maybe I could learn something. Maybe I'll send them a survey and just ask them, hey, what about the tool didn't live up to your expectations? I've surveyed like 20,000 of these people. I got like 4 responses. Yeah, and so, it's like, it's just not a population where there's much leverage, unfortunately.
Okay.
The better move is to try to engage them up front, and then you never have to deal with that.
So to the person who just asked, you heard it from Andrew straight up. If you don't have your customers, your accounts activated, and there's a certain period of time after which, they become completely disengaged, there's no way to recover. No tool can help you. No customer success can help you. No feedback, no surveys can help you. None of that are effective. I'll ask one last question, while we still wait for others to come in. Are there any B2C benchmarks versus B2B benchmarks on activation rates? You mentioned about 25-30%. Maybe Andrew, could you maybe share some insights? Is that B2B or is that more B2C?
Yeah, I'm speaking to SMB SaaS, kind of that prosumer B2C2B world, right? So that's the world that I come from. Wistia, which you can sell to individuals and also teams, and PostScript, which is kind of the same. There's many small businesses and then also some large teams. So what I see is typically 35 to 40% is usually the benchmark that I look for when selling a tool to that audience. And yes, there's different for B2B versus B2C. Do you have benchmarks published, Guru? If not, I'm going to send folks to a different resource.
So we have it inside the product itself.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have, and I can pull that up very quickly. What we have published inside the product, it came from, Winning by Design and a couple of West Bush's things. The activation rate for B2B, we've seen it somewhere between 20 to 30%. Typically, if it's less than $1 million. For B2C, activation rates are higher if it happens within the first 3 to 4 hours time, meaning there's a distribution curve. But if it goes beyond 3 to 4 hours, it's almost zero, right? So, which is where B2C is trying to get, to reduce the time to activation to hardly less than an hour or two, because beyond that, customers don't have the attention span. The conversion rate, on the other hand, is only 10% after that. What I mean by conversion rate is anyone who's activated, how long does it take for them to actually start paying you? So if the activation happens within the first 3 days, the conversion happens within the first 2 weeks, almost at 50%. But if the activation after 7 to 10 days, conversion is about only 10%, beyond that. So there's a distribution curve towards that as well. And we can share some of that, to the live chat audience later on as well.
Yeah, so sign up for ThriveStack. They'll give you some more data. If you want something that's paper, there's 2 other places you could look. One would be OpenView. So if you Google OpenView benchmarks report, OpenView is Boston-based PLG VC. They release some benchmarking data. And then the other one would be Lenny's podcast. So Lenny Rachatsky is the former head of growth at Airbnb. He has a large newsletter and podcast. If you Google Lenny's podcast or Lenny's newsletter activation data, maybe 2 years old at this point, he has a ton of data broken down by industry, by vertical, B2B, B2C, all kinds of good stuff. So 2 other places to look in addition.
Absolutely. So Kyle Poyer, if you happen to be around, we have talked about you. You mentioned you on this this webinar. So this is great, Andrew. Thank you so much for your time. I don't see any more questions from the audience yet. It was wonderful to have so much of great insights from you. We should do this again, slightly in a different format, as we talked. But again, to all the audience, thank you for attending our first live webinar on, find your growth leads, find your growth drivers. Thank you, Andrew, to being our first guest on this this live webinar series. Appreciate to everyone. Okay, I'm going to end the event now.